I wanted to give an introduction to the prohibition of idolatry for Noahides, which is not so simple in this day and age because in most parts of the world, you don't have something like what you see described in the Bible as idolatry. And therefore, we have to come at it, I think, from a different angle, because how is it still relevant if you're not, taking some wooden statue out of your closet and bowing down to it? How is idolatry a problem anymore? And yet we know that there is a nitzchiyut, an eternality, an eternally applicable Torah, which contains these 7 laws. So the prohibition against idolatry is still in force and in effect. We have to figure out exactly how, though. We know that it is a fundamental principle within the Torah. It's probably the fundamental principle within the Torah, for the simple reason that the great novel revelation of Torah is that there is only one true God who is worthy of worship. And this principle is not only central to the Jewish faith, but also applies to Noahides, non-Jews who adhere to the 7 laws of Noah. Now, we explored the idea of faith principles in a series of shiurim, of classes, on the 13 principles of faith as set down by Maimonides. Essentially, while we fully acknowledge that there are 2 separate tracks for the observance of mitzvot, there are 613 for Jews and 7 for Noahides, we still have to ask the question, what about principles of faith? And the reason why we have to ask that question is because although we know that the 7 Noahide laws contains a law forbidding the worship of idols, does it also require the belief in God, even though that's not explicitly listed in the 7? When we consult the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, of Maimonides, we find that the main benefit of adopting the Torah faith as a Noahide, besides living a righteous life in this world, is a portion in the world to come. However, says the Rambam, that reward only goes to someone who accepts the yoke of the 7 commandments on the basis of the fact that this was communicated by Moses in the Torah, that this is what B'nai Noach did from time immemorial. So from the Rambam's perspective, not only does a Noahide have to believe in God, but also has to believe in the idea that the Torah is from God himself. And all of this makes logical sense, right? That ties together very, very easily. But we still have to contend with the fact that in the list of 7 mitzvot, there's no specific mitzvah for non-Jews to believe in God. We have to figure this puzzle out a bit. Now, what are the ramifications of this? So I was thinking that in order to really understand, we'd have to divide the non-Jewish world into 2 categories. The first being non-Jews who have not consciously, deliberately accepted the 7 Noahide mitzvot, and non-Jews who have accepted the 7 Noahide mitzvot. The 7 laws are applicable to all human beings, regardless of their observance of them. In other words, you might double park, even though there are laws against double parking, but that doesn't mean that the law doesn't apply to you. But we might say, look, as long as a non-Jew does not worship idols, we don't need to probe into their theological beliefs. Lozum gain. But someone who identifies himself or herself as a Ben or Bat Noach, a Noahide, we would expect that person to believe in God and his Torah, since it is the source of the 7 laws. When it comes to a non-Jew who does not call himself Noahide, not worshiping idols means that he is simply not liable for punishment according to Torah law, even if he's not living a conscious Noahide existence. But when it comes to a Noahide person, it goes beyond reward and punishment. In other words, the existence of a code of 7 commandments is like something that can sort of exist in theory, or something that exists through the implementation of it and through the self-identification of being that thing, of being that Noahide. It goes beyond reward and punishment for a Noahide person, because it flows from a belief in God and an acceptance of the faith principles of the Torah. It's not just a system that happens to be out there. So I think that there is, and it's something that I've been thinking about for a while, that's really the bridge that closes the gap between somebody who is not Jewish and the Torah. I can imagine that somebody who is approaching Torah, approaching God, approaching Torah faith, even in this form of 7 Noahide laws, must wonder to themselves, when am I in? Like, when does it click into place that I have this relationship with Hashem, with Torah? When do I become a Ben Noach, so that I can sort of settle into that identity, so that I can relax into that space. And here, this is, I think, what it's all about, that it's like, it's not just about being a nice non-Jewish person who says, okay, there's these nice 7 laws, and so whatever, I won't kill anybody, I won't steal from anyone, I won't rape anybody, and, I won't worship idols. And I'll submit my complaints to a proper court of law. Good. It's like they're very polite, genteel people who don't curse. And even if they are atheists, they don't go around cursing God. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this is coming from a place of attachment. So I think that's really the bridge that is there. That there are things that we would expect. I'll give you an example. And this is something that does play into the question of idolatry, which is something called shituf. Jews are not allowed to believe in a hypostatic union. Are non-Jews allowed to believe in a hypostatic union? Meaning to say, do they get punished for believing in a hypostatic union? In other words, it's like a bad idea. Does it render them idolaters? Not necessarily, and I'm saying that simply because there's an argument amongst our authorities on this topic, and there are very real practical ramifications for that. Because if we were to regard certain people as idolaters, that would have an impact in terms of the halacha. Can I do business with this person? Am I allowed to greet this person on their holiday? Am I allowed to extend holiday greetings? There's a Gemara that talks about a whole set of behaviors called darchei shalom. which Jews are obligated, according to our sages, to interact with the non-Jewish world in such a way that we cultivate an atmosphere of peace. So, for example, we bury the dead of our non-Jewish neighbors. We extend holiday greetings to them, not necessarily in the specific form. We don't want to verbally acknowledge some form of foreign worship, but there's a number of these things. It's in the Tractate of Gittin. I don't have to go into all of them now. But if we were to regard people as idolaters, we might have a completely different take on that. So a hypostatic union might be very problematic for a non-Jew who is not consciously identifying themselves as a Noahide, which according to Maimonides means a belief in God, a belief in Torah, a belief that Moses communicated these 7 laws in the Torah when it was revealed at Mount Sinai. That the relevance of the 7 Noahide laws at this point in history doesn't stem from the commands given to Adam or to Noah, but to the re-revelation of these things at Mount Sinai. That person we would expect not to believe in a hypostatic union, even if it was not something that condemned a non-Jew as an idolater, because once we're here, once you're part of the conversation, once you're part of the Torah community in its larger sense, where is there any room for such a thing? So I wanted to bring that up because to illustrate that there's a difference between simply not belonging to the Jewish faith and having taken your place in this particular relationship with Torah. If we look in Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah, Tractate Sanhedrin, this is chapter 10, and it's the first Mishnah. He says that Hashem, may he be blessed, is the one whom it is fitting to serve, to exalt, to make his greatness known, and to perform his commandments. And that such should not be done for anything that is lower than him in existence, be it angels, stars, planets, the elements, and that which is comprised of them. But these things are all designed and have no judgment or choice over their actions. In other words, when you look through the Hubble telescope or any of the other super advanced instruments that we have to look at the universe, and you're witnessing this massive array of objects, of celestial objects, it's an interesting thing because scientists typically cite this as being their quasi-religious experience of feeling very small in the face of these things. Almost like these orbiting objects or asteroids or simply the principles of physics themselves that we see have some sort of a personality in and of themselves. According to what we're reading over here, you're just looking at a system which the creator of it has pressed play, and it does not operate on its own accord. It operates at the will of God himself. Only he alone, says the Rambam, has this ability to have choice, to have judgment, to design. Accordingly, it is improper to serve anything below him, even as an intermediary to bring oneself closer to him. Rather, a person should focus his or her thoughts on him alone and disregard everything else. And this 5th principle is alluded to throughout the Torah regarding the prohibition of idolatry. Now, when I said even as an intermediary, that should set bells off for anybody who is an ex-Christian, because that is the whole That's the whole essence of Christianity, really, is that you have this guy who is the intermediary between you and God, and you can't even get to God without going through him. Like God needs a secretary. I mean, it's, I have good news. The good news is you can have a direct relationship with God. You don't have to go through anybody. Not only do you not have to go through anybody, but you ought not to go through anybody. You ought to view yourself as directly standing before God. What we see in the Rambam statement is that the worship and service, which are fundamental human religious activities, they are due solely to God, and that any form of intermediary is rejected. And this is the essence of the pure monotheism that the Torah preaches. I don't like that word, where God alone is acknowledged as the source of all existence and power. Now, the last point here is key. There are what could be called gross forms of idolatry, such as the worship of objects, whether they're celestial or man-made. And it's rare to find this really obvious type of idolatry, at least in, I think, the spaces that most of us inhabit. There are elsewhere in the world syncretistic religions, such as in parts of Asia and Africa and South America, or amongst indigenous populations in the South Pacific. Now, we have people from all over the world, Baruch Hashem, in our community here. We have people who live in Africa. We have people who live in India. I don't know necessarily, because I'm ignorant in this regard, as to exactly how these things work. I know that there are people, I've met people who have come from Africa, or whose families have come from Africa, and have told me that there are people who worship the moon. There are people who worship, various other celestial bodies. But we also have people from the subcontinent, and I'm curious as to what is the status of a lot of objects that we find, a lot of avatars, a lot of gurus. How does that, is that true idolatry? Or is that something that from a Torah perspective might be looked at that way, but is it necessarily? So that's a question I have. But then there are also finer or more abstract forms of idolatry, such as belief in an idea. Under communism, for example, the state takes the place of God. You owe all of your allegiance to the state. There's also cases where a person believes that something other than God has power, such as the power of money. If you've ever heard the expression, money makes the world go round, or money means never having to say you're sorry, those kinds of things. Or let's say prestige or political power. People also go through some process of submission to celebrities. We see this all the time, that you'll have some famous singer who arrives in a place and people camp out waiting for them, camp out waiting to buy tickets. And when they finally show up, their bodyguards get to shove everybody out of the way. Somehow you're reduced to this level of not being able to breathe the same air as these people, right? Like that there's some interesting hierarchical, and these people are at the top of the pyramid. Now, it's not the idolatry necessarily that is described technically in the Torah, but I think that the instinct is similar, where we think that something other than God is the source of virtue, is the source of meaning, is the source of being able to get things done. Okay. Now, there is a fundamental principle of faith that is in the liturgy that we have, which is based on those 13 principles of faith. And it says, I believe with complete faith that it is only proper to pray to the Creator. May his name be blessed, and that it's improper to pray to anything or anyone besides him. Right? This is the logical positive that corresponds to idolatry, that there is one who is to be worshipped. We understand that nothing else is to be worshipped, but that it is his exclusivity, his exclusive existence, which generates our obligation to devote ourselves to him exclusively. We also see in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, you shall not have any gods before me. So here we have a prohibition against idolatry in the form of personalities, in the form of other forces, right? There's no other deity or entity who should be worshipped besides God. This is the verse that is most commonly cited when dealing with the problem of the Trinity, for example. Right? Why would there be? Now, it says, al panai, when it says, you shall not have any gods before me, you can't have any other gods al panai, upon my face. Like, there's not like this representative that you have to go through to get to him. Just to go a little bit deeper, we have the commentary of the Malbim on that verse. And he says the following thing. The Rambam wrote what we saw before. Actually, elsewhere. This is another comment of the Rambam. Anyone who considers the idea that there is another God besides God himself, that person has transgressed a prohibition. As the verse states, you shall not have any other gods besides me. And this person is a heretic regarding the main principle of the Torah, a principle upon which everything depends. Therefore, Chazal, our sages, say that I am the Lord your God, and you shall not have any other gods besides me, were stated simultaneously in one utterance. They're unlike human speech, which comes out sequentially. We can't say two things at the same time. Of course, we can gaslight people, but that doesn't mean that we're actually physically uttering two statements at once. But that's not a problem for God. So, according to Chazal, I am the Lord your God, and you shall not have any other gods besides me. The first and second commandments occurred at the same time. What's the ramification of that? That these are two sides of the same coin, and that these mitzvah, one positive mitzvah, one negative mitzvah, actually derive from one another. Right? So that I am the Lord your God necessitates that you don't have any other one. And that you and similarly in reverse, that the fact that you have no other God besides God necessitates that God is the only one. So what the Malbim is emphasizing over here is that the belief in God's oneness, his unity, his uniqueness, necessitates a total rejection of any other deity. Right? It's a dual commandment where the importance of there being only one God and the prohibition of idolatry are actually intertwined principles. When I think about this, it's actually amazing because, the question that we asked before was, well, there's no explicit mitzvah listed in the 7 Noahide laws that requires the belief in God. I think we have our answer over here. That where there's a prohibition against idolatry, it is absolutely embedded in that prohibition that there is one God. So, just going a little bit further here, we have a verse in Psalms chapter 121, verses 1 through 2, where we are talking about the reliance on God. This is one of the great implications of the existence of an exclusive one God, is that if you're going to rely on anything, you rely on him. A song of ascents, I lift my eyes unto the mountains. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. Very beautiful language of the Psalms, that first we lift our eyes unto the mountains. That's an interesting thing. It suggests that having a religious life requires that we lift our gaze, that we look beyond the mundane for help. He lifts his eyes unto the mountains. What the mountains represent objects that are much larger than human beings. If you've ever stood at the foot of a mountain, you could see how overwhelmingly large this thing is, much bigger than you are. And meanwhile, we can still ask the question, from where will my help come? It doesn't matter how big these things are. God isn't greatest because he's biggest. God is greatest because he's infinite. That's not a quantitative difference. It's a qualitative difference, considering that we are mortal and he is immortal. We are finite and he is infinite. If size was the issue, then we would worship the sequoia trees because they're big. Or we would worship the planets because they're big. We worship Hashem without regard to this physical quality of size or of greatness. We worship God because he is completely transcendent of all these things, totally infinite, completely beyond all of it. So what we learn in this verse in Psalms is a very deep trust and reliance on God, because we recognize him as the ultimate source of help and support. It's not an impersonal relationship. Christianity has very often portrayed, Jesus as some kind of cool hippie dude who kind of like accompanies you on your journey. He's like a good friend. And you need him. Why? Because God is kind of out there and impersonal. The answer is no. That's the whole point. We're not talking about size here. Because God is infinite, he's with you absolutely in the most intimate fashion all the time. Now, the Metzudat David, in his commentary on this verse, says the following. He says, I lift my eyes. It's the way of a person seeking others to help him climb a mountain, to cast his eyes to a distance to see where they'll come from. All of a sudden, we find ourselves very alone, so we scan the area. Is there anybody here who can help me? But my help, says King David, that is to say, I only find help from the Lord. Even if there are other backpackers in the area. Ultimately, if there's any form of salvation, it came from God. Even if it comes in the form of people who can help you, this is still God extending his help to you. It comes in many different forms. We have to train our consciousness to recognize it, to see it. Now, we can learn this from a human example. We can learn what the relationship is between human beings and God from, for example, the story of Uriah and King David that we find in the 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 11, and as it's explained in the Talmud in Tractate Shabbat 56a. Here we have a lesson about loyalty and recognition of authority. The verse says, "And Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah sit in tents, and my master Joab and my master's servants encamp on the face of the field." He was complaining. Now, we also know that David then sent him out to the front lines to get killed. But why wasn't King David liable for doing that? And the answer is because Uriah rebelled against the throne. How did he rebel against the throne? He said, "My master Joab." Joab was one of King David's great generals. And Uriah is referring to him, the general, with this language of "my master." Now, when you're in the presence of a king, you can't refer to anyone else as "my master." That alone is considered rebellion. So what we learn from the story is that where there is a singular authority, just like we have it in human form, as a monarchy, where there is a divinely mandated monarchy, such as the one belonging to King David, to King Solomon. So then you can't attribute authority to anyone else. So that's very similar to recognizing God's exclusive sovereignty in the world. In a sense, of course, we do have to treat people of authority with respect for their office, but we have to remind ourselves that God is the one who has mastery over everything. And this is what I think serves as a good introduction to the problem of idolatry, because it's specifically that we would consider anything other than God as having domain, as having power, and imagine that there might be a hierarchy where it's like a committee ruling the world. This is critical for Noahides. It's a cornerstone of their Torah observance because it emphasizes the recognition and worship of God alone. And so we will continue to delve into the various technical aspects of this commandment. And by doing so, we're going to form and develop and cultivate a direct and unwavering relationship with our Creator. May we be blessed.